Hi, everyone, and welcome to what I think is a very special live stream today, because we're very fortunate to have, and you see him on screen there, Mark Slade, who is in the UK, but Mark is needs no introduction, really. I think now we can say that in all fairness to regular viewers of this live stream and this channel. Incredible record as a race engineer for teams such as McLaren, Mercedes, Renault, Lotus, and latterly Haas, Ferrari. And I think he'll probably correct me on this, but I think he's won 2 Japanese Grand Prix, maybe more than that. But anyway, Mark is one of our guests, and the other is Gavin White. We're very lucky to have Gavin with us, who you met on a live stream a little bit earlier, a couple of weeks ago. The co-founder and CEO of About Energy, great company based in the UK, specializes in the simulation and modeling of battery technology. And we're very lucky to have Gavin join us. I'm just going to put you on screen now, Gav, joining us from, so that's Mark again, but he'll be on screen, don't worry. Joining us from Florida, where he is for 2 days at an incredibly exotic sounding thing called a battery conference. I think on that, Mark, yeah, there you are, Gav. Yeah, what time is it there in Florida?
Nice. I think you might have oversold it. It's 7 a.m. here in
7
Orlando.
o'clock.
Yeah, out here for the battery conference.
Yeah. What's the official title of this said battery conference?
It's IBS, which stands for International Battery Seminar, not the
Yeah.
other kind of IBS.
And what sort of format is that? I mean, how exotic is it?
Yeah, so it's like a 2-day conference with talks on maybe like 3 different parallel streams for the 2 days. And then
Yep.
there's companies, like very cool companies here actually, including like SpaceX, Amazon,
Brilliant.
Tesla, like all of the big battery companies have a presence.
Good stuff. And well, I'll start with you first of all, just my general question to you. What is your feeling about how Formula One has gone so far in the first 2 races? I would say to say Formula One is polarized, I think is to understate the case. And it's not necessarily the old fogies who love the old style racing and the tire burning, fuel burning Formula One that we used to know and love, against the technophobes of the current era. It's more to do with overtaking, perhaps unreliability, perhaps a spectre of maybe some additional danger. I don't know. I mean, what's your take on the first 2 races so far from your perspective?
Yeah, well, from the perspective of being a fan, I don't think it's ever been better in my perspective. It's so unpredictable, which makes for really great racing. Like when the cars line up at the very start, you literally have no idea who's going to make it into the first corner. You can be probably pretty certain it's going to be the Ferraris these days.
If I can just stop you there, you literally have no idea who's going to be on the grid, I think you could also say.
Yeah, so from a fan perspective, it's the unpredictability that makes it exciting, and the number of overtakes being much higher just adds that extra element of uncertainty. But from the engineering point of view, I could definitely see the frustration with yeah, just so many engineering challenges, the super equipment, etc. So I can see it from the engineer's perspective, but ultimately for the fans, I do see a lot of great advantages.
Mark, if I can just switch to you, what's your take on how it's gone so far from your perspective?
I'm sort of a little bit more frustrated, but not massively so, in that the downside for me is seeing the drivers or the cars slowing down into the high speed corners, like turn 9 in Melbourne. I thought that was a shame to see that. I don't think it's ideally what we want to see from the cars. The car's not on the limit going into that corner as such. On the other hand, I think whether you use DRS or a power differentiation to improve overtaking, I don't have a strong view that that's a problem personally. What I would like to see is, I think the cars themselves aerodynamically are probably significantly better in terms of their ability to follow than the previous generation, because of the focus that they've changed on the inwashing from the front wing. So in some ways, I'd just like to see that having more of an effect, and the power differentiation maybe slightly less of an effect. So to me, it looks a little too easy at the moment for overtaking. The Ferrari isn't as fast a car as the Mercedes. The reason we're seeing lots of overtaking is because the Ferrari gets ahead at the start, because they've qualified well enough to do that, which is great. Then we see the Mercedes come past on the straight because it's a faster car and it's got this massive power differentiation. So I think that's a little artificial. And as Mercedes get better at starts, unless Ferrari can improve their car significantly, I think we'll get to the point where that's not going to happen so much. But I'd just like to see a greater emphasis on the aero benefits helping cars follow and giving good racing, and a little bit less of the cars slowing down into the high-speed corners. We were just talking earlier about what you're seeing with the slowing down, and I actually think more of that is lift and coast than this super clipping. So from what I can see in the data that is available, it looks like the drivers are lifting to do the lift and coast and getting the energy recovery. And the super clipping, it wasn't so obvious that was happening a lot. Just deducing from seeing the few occasions when they allow us to see a battery level indicator from an onboard shot, which isn't very often. And I think it's fascinating to see when we do get that opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learnt about the way we're going to use the onboards and indeed the graphics that are going to be shown. I suppose F1 are thinking about that right now as we speak, and one would hope so, because certainly there's a lot of potential there for improving things. Let's get on to some questions. Sarosh Soman, who is one of our regulars, usually has one of the first questions. He's a channel member as well. So Sarosh, thank you very much. Welcome. And he usually says dumb question. It's usually not a dumb question. He says, hello, dumb question. Is the battery regeneration rate different between the teams? As in, can it be calibrated to how the individual team's drivers want, say 200 miles an hour, 20% lift off for the same generation rate? Can the teams develop the batteries during the course of the season? This is a separate question, really. E.g., is it allowed for the teams to work with the battery supplier to improve the charge rate? Do you want to start with that, Mark, or Gavin, do you want to go for that?
Mark, if you want to. Yes.
Well, there are going to be some basic things like in terms of the recharge rate and the effect it has on braking. That's going to be function mainly of the brake balance and the proportion of. I'm sure they can adjust the proportion of energy recovery coming from the MG UK and from the brakes themselves to come up with something that the driver's comfortable with, and I imagine that's something that can vary. Certainly from driver to driver, let alone from car to car. It's something I did wonder, because obviously going from 120 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts recovery is a very big step, and I did wonder if that was going to overwhelm the rear axle. But they seem to have managed that okay. So I can imagine that from a setup point of view, there are ways of managing that so that it doesn't. So you get to the point where you can recover as much as you can without upsetting the driver, because otherwise then you won't be able to slam on the brakes and then you won't get enough recovery. So that's how they'll be balancing that out. But from a technical point of view, in terms of can one car recover more quickly than another, that is something I'm not sure. I mean, it looks like the Mercedes is able to recover more around a lap, or more easily around a lap, and so that means their drivers have to do less super clipping, less lift and coast, and they get a faster lap time. But I'm not sure what the mechanism for that is, other than maybe they just have more grip.
Gavin, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for sort of software upgrades through the season. I'd imagine a lot of the energy recovery now is done through clever software, where they're basically using as much software as they can to control sort of the current rates going into the battery to control how fast it charges up. But there's going to be very little opportunity to upgrade the fundamental hardware of the battery. I think they're only allowed 2 different battery packs through the whole season, and they're not going to be able to sort of change the cell design or chemistry through the season, as far as I'm aware. So I think a lot of the changes are going to come through driver behavior, but then also probably software to control the sort of charge rates during the energy recovery sessions. And they might actually change the strategy as well, right, to decide like where they can recover energy in a lap and where not. We've kind of seen that because the battery pack's quite large, but there's only a small usable SoC window that they're allowed to use. So they can actually like fully charge and discharge it a couple of times as they go around the circuit. So I think controlling exactly the most optimal positions to do that full sort of charge and discharge as they go around the circuit, I think that's probably where most of the opportunity is.
Did you, just to continue Mark's point, did you envisage any issues going from 120 to 350 kilowatts?
Well, it's a massive increase, right? Huge increase in electrical power,
Yeah.
and that's all the electrical systems, like your whole control systems, your inverters, all the MOSFETs that control the electrical switching, and all the thermal loads that are going to come alongside that as well. So it's not no surprise that teams are struggling with some of the engineering aspects of the battery as well, that we're seeing, especially like the thermal challenges.
Mm. There are plenty of questions we could then lead on to in terms of Aston Martin and Honda, obviously, from what we're talking about right now. But before we go on to that, any thoughts on why we saw more electrical dramas, I think it's fair to say, in China than we did in Australia? And obviously, George had one going into Q3, and then we had both McLarens, which is pretty startling from a Formula One perspective, to have both cars not even take the grid, a front-running team like that. It kind of was kind of shocking to see that. Any thoughts on what is going on there? Same engine supplier. I mean, it's bizarre.
Yeah, very bizarre, and I think the McLaren said it was separate electrical issues as
Yeah.
well, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
hard
but
to
I
know.
mean, as an engineer, electrical issues covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it? Everything from a spark plug to software, I guess.
Yeah, it could be software, wiring, connectors,
Loom.
PCBs, the battery system. Yeah, it could be a whole range of issues. But yeah, very bizarre to see that, like two different issues affecting such a well-renowned team. I don't know, Mark, if you have any thoughts on
Yeah,
how that could change this season.
it does seem very strange. I wonder how much, as I understand it, the whole drivetrain is the same across the two cars. So I don't think McLaren have the ability to. I don't know where the crossover is in terms of where their own parts come into the system. Obviously, they've got MAT, and I believe it's not actually part of the same group anymore. I think MAT got sold off, but I suspect there's still some link with them, and they certainly were making batteries for Honda in the past, so they've obviously got good capability in this area, but I don't know to what extent it might be a problem of interface between McLaren's side of things and Mercedes' side of things. The one thing I would say is that with the hybrid engines from 2014 to last year, I was actually always surprised that we didn't have more problems with cars getting to the grid, because it wasn't at all unusual to, certainly in my experience, to have the cars firing up on a Thursday or a Friday or even a Saturday or Sunday morning and have dramas. And I don't remember ever not making it to the grid, apart from I think with Pastor Maldonado, we didn't get into qualifying in 2014 in Melbourne. But there were always lots of problems, but they always seemed to get resolved. But I was always amazed that given the number of problems that we had, it was always a bit of a miracle that we seemed to get away with it. And I guess now it's just being pushed a bit harder, and where we just got away with it in the past, they're now not getting away with it, much the same as in that first year of 2014. But yeah, it is odd that McLaren had lots of problems and Mercedes had less. I think I got the impression that the Mercedes issue in qualifying might have been related to that nose box change that they did, because it does seem too coincidental that they had the problem with the flap adjustment in Q2, or the flap not recovering, and then swapped the nose box, and then immediately had a problem with the car going out for Q3. So to me, that sounds like some sort of self-inflicted error, that, in terms of the way that nose box change was done, and maybe something wasn't quite right there, or something in the code maybe that didn't allow for that to happen without something being reset, that they failed to reset in the garage before sending the car out. So that's slightly less of an issue. That's just a learning thing, I suspect. But the McLaren thing is very, very odd. And given that Alpine have the same engine, same PU, drivetrain, and as far as I know, they haven't had any big issues so far. So yeah, strange one.
Of course, the wags out there are saying that it was papaya rules, and as soon as one car had the electrical problem, was unable to start, they immediately withdrew the other car. But I suppose that's not the case.
No.
Yeah. Gavin, thoughts on that nose box change? Could that actually have an implication somewhere in the electrics, do you think?
Well, it definitely have implications in the electrics, but as to what implications, it's so complex now. The cars are unbelievably complex, right? It's like a proper Yeah, like full on computer brain, so many different circuits.
Yeah.
And from my experience, like mechanical systems, we built a Formula Student car that was like very mechanical. And when things broke, you could see that they were broke. And it was quite obvious if things were sort of rubbing or not working. But then in my PhD, developing electrical control systems and PCBs and software, it's so many bugs and issues. And like if a PCB doesn't work, it's hours and hours to figure out what's going wrong in it. You can't see you often just can't see if something's broken or not soldered correctly. So yeah, I think it's a lot longer to diagnose these issues than probably it was in your day, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one thing I wonder is maybe imagine heat soak is probably quite a big issue with the electronics on the current cars. And maybe that's one of the issues that we're seeing, even if a car successfully completes qualifying and then can't be started the following morning, it could well be because something's got fried since the car stopped and got hot, sat still in Parc Fermé. So, yeah, I can see why these things might happen, but why one car should suffer more than another. So I guess that suggests that maybe the McLaren has a bigger issue with heat soak, and it might be something to do with that. As an example, it's pure speculation, but I'm trying to look for why one car with the same powertrain might perform differently to another. And I think temperature management is likely to be one of the big areas.
Yeah. Okay, next question from Vicky. 1 second. Right. Hi, this is for Gav. Do you answer to Gav? Okay. Hi, Gav. In China, the race commentary, they were saying that Antonelli was on his own. The battery system was able to deploy efficiently. And that is why he was able to increase the gap, whereas Russell was stuck in traffic and he had to use overtake button to get past the Ferraris. By that time, the gap was 7 seconds. Are there any machine learning algorithms used in the softwares and using OT not efficient for long runs? In other words, is that the case, or was just the tires going off, I wonder?
Things right, like trying to overtake using your boost button is a lot less efficient than using it optimally around the lap. Like for example, in a lap, there's going to be only a certain number of overtake areas, so you need to save your boost for them areas to make sure you can get past. Whereas if you're out in clear air by yourself, you can just use your battery the most optimal to gain as much speed and acceleration in all the high speed areas. So they sound very similar, but that's like slight nuances in where you'd actually deploy that energy, which is going to affect lap times. So I think it's a whole load of issues to do with clean, dirty air, battery being used suboptimally, having to sort of actually go off the racing line compared to stay on the racing line, as well as like tires, etc. But yeah, the teams will definitely be running a lot of algorithms. I'm sure a lot of even AI and machine learning algorithms. Some, technically regression learning is machine learning, just doing like a linear fit on a graph. So I'm sure they're doing a lot of algorithms to figure out where's the best areas to deploy battery, both for overtake, but also to increase lap times. But I'd suspect that that's why you see such a big difference, because the drivers are having to sort of race suboptimally whenever they're actually competing with somebody.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Mark, isn't it? I mean, because we're used to seeing a driver in George's situation, as Gavin says, the tires get dirty, maybe you're overheating the tires as well, you're behind other cars, all the usual things that come into abusing the tires if you're in traffic, as distinct from being out in front. But how much do you think that is now coloured by the energy deployment situation? It's an interesting question, isn't it? And if George was unable, let me rephrase it. If George was unable to close that gap in the end when he got into free air, what had he used? He hasn't used too much energy, has he? Because he's recovering it at the end of every lap, in theory.
Yeah, so I think initially, once he gets in front of those other cars, he will have been at a deficit in terms of energy, and he's probably used a lot of energy to pass whichever car was running. So was it Lewis before he was in clear air behind Kimi Antonelli. So it's going to take a lap or two to get his battery back up to optimum level. Also, the cars, they do learn. So the powertrain learns what is the optimum deployment of energy. The drivers aren't manually controlling the energy deployment. So if you've been in a race, an overtaking situation where you're using energy to overtake, then the system won't won't be ready to deploy what energy it has completely optimally once you're in clear air. So it'll take a few laps for the car or the powertrain to learn how to deploy optimally. So that there's a couple of things there that will mean that his initial performance after overtaking, finally getting his clear air, he won't be able to go as quickly as he will be able to in 2 or 3 laps, because the energy levels are low and the system isn't deploying optimally. And then I think the old things of the tyres have got hot, the tyres have got damaged because of following another car are then going to play a factor. And that damage, although it does recover to some extent, it doesn't fully recover. So once you've been behind other cars fighting, your tyres are never as good again as they were when you're in clear air. We used to see that all the time. So, for instance, Kevin often used to say, he'd catch up to a car, spend 4 or 5 laps battling to get past it. Once he got past, he'd find he didn't have the performance that he had anymore. The tyres were screwed. And he then struggled to pull away from the car that he'd caught easily previously. And so that will still be a factor as well. So I think it's a combination of these things. And that, I think, is a bit of a downside of the regulations as well, a little bit, is that this is another factor that means that once a car's got past slower cars, it's going to struggle to catch up the car ahead as easily it would. But I think the tyres are still the dominant factor in that.
Okay, but having said that, let me ask you both this. Do you think that business of the car having to readapt and spending 2 laps to get back to optimum energy, do you think that's something the teams will get on top of as the season progresses, and there won't be that delay? Or do you think that's something that's inherent with this system that will always be there?
I think it's built in to the technology. I don't think that's something that you can necessarily improve dramatically. I mean, I'm not sure how much of a difference it makes. I just know our engine engineers last year, when I was working with Haas, would say if a driver drove differently on a lap during practice, say he did a slow lap and he braked differently, or just was deliberately not at 100% performance. Obviously, they had a way of deleting slow laps, so they didn't influence the algorithm. But if a driver drove a pretty fast lap, but in a strange way, that would have an effect on the next lap or two to some extent. Well, I don't think we're talking half a second. I think we're talking, a tenth at most, but it would have an effect. But I suspect that it's just built into the car's calculation, basically.
I would blame the guys that run the battery sim and modeling companies for this. Please advise Gavin White.
Yeah.
I mean, is that right? That sort of, do you think that's always going to be there? That sort of memory thing like that? That seems bizarre to me.
That will make sense, because when you're in 3rd place, you obviously need to optimize for getting into 2nd place. It would be crazy that when you're in 3rd place, you're saying, no, let's optimize the car setup, the powertrain to set really good lap times once we're into 2nd place to then catch up on 1st. Like, you actually need to tackle the task at hand.
Yeah, I get that, but the problem is the delay once you got into the new position. It doesn't reset itself immediately. I find that extraordinary.
Yeah, but think about like a human driver. If you were driving laps of a track, so you've spent, I don't know, 10 laps following somebody, overtaking them, etc., and now you get to clear air. It's not like your muscle memory kicks back into qualifying that like, oh, now you can just go back out and set exactly the laps you used to do. And so how a human brain has to sort of, you have to learn and adapt and figure it out the same way a computer does at the same time as well. So you can't just suddenly like flick the switch and like, oh, let's just copy what we did in qualifying, because what you did in qualifying was a very different car setup in terms of fuel load, tire temperatures, etc. So that's just inherent to how humans work, and it's also how inherent to how algorithms work. Like, you have to have that learning period as well. So I think it is just completely inherent to the engineering.
Interesting. Well, it'll be fascinating to see whether or not that changes at all, or whether that becomes a factor. Imagine if it's 2 cars fighting for the World Championship in the last race, and it comes down to some tiny little thing like that. It could do, couldn't it? Bizarre. Yeah, well, yeah, but it's still there, isn't it? A tenth of a second is a tenth of a second.
Yeah, it's going to be there.
Mm.
You're going to know what influence it has, because it's buried deep into the data. Effectively, I guess the PU engineers will know how far off optimum they were on a particular lap in retrospect. But I think from a technology point of view, it does show that things are getting pretty sophisticated. But whether that helps racing per se is, it's another matter. But yeah, I find it interesting.
Well,
I think that's the beauty of Formula One, right? It's like half driver, half engineering. Like, we could have a formula where every driver had the exact same car, right? And I don't think anybody wants that. I think we want half of it to be the engineering, half of it to be the driver. So I think having that variability just really forces the drivers to sort of use what they got.
Yeah.
Shout out to Jim Honts. Thank you very much, Jim, for your super chat. Excellent. Thank you. Nice thumbs up from you. Hurricane OK1 asks Peter, but I think this is definitely Gavin and Mark as well. A lot of drivers are talking of different ways in which big accidents could happen due to these regulations. Are these cars under these regs just a massive accident waiting to happen? And I suppose you could look at that from a number of areas, one being the start, another being speed differential, and anything else that may go on mechanically with the cars, I guess. And we've seen a few incidents already. I mean, we saw nothing to do with the electronics, but we saw with the active arrow with Lewis, I think, Mark, in his spin in practice in China, didn't we? You were pointing that out. What's your feeling about the safety side of Formula One now? We'll start with Mark.
I think it's inevitable that when you've got new technologies and new things that people are trying to get to grips with, it does mean that problems are more likely to occur. And when you're trying to get a car and driver going around the circuit at absolute maximum speed possible, anything that disturbs what's the thing functioning correctly is going to cause problems. And it's going to be a bit more dangerous at this point because of that. When things go wrong, it is dangerous. But it is part of the sport. But I think from what I've seen so far, to me, it doesn't look like we've seen a huge step increase in risk. I mean, that we've had, I think the Colapinto going slowly, I can't remember if it was practice or qualifying in Melbourne. That was clearly the car had got some sort of mechanical failure or functional failure, and he wasn't able to go fast down the straight. What he should have done is pulled offline immediately as soon as he had the problem, and he didn't. So in my mind, the risk was caused by the driver not reacting to an obvious failure, and that could have happened in the past as well. Lewis having the problem with his rear wing not being fully functional when he hit the brakes, again with DRS, that was always a possibility. So that's not really a new thing, other than it is a particularly new technology that they'd introduced that race and they were learning, and that it slightly caught them out. Is it acceptable? That I'm not really the one to judge, I don't think. It's always going to be risky. The cars are massively safer than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, that's for sure. And I don't think I've seen anything that I think has massively increased the risk. We've had one car struggle to get off the line in Melbourne, and thankfully, I think it was Colapinto who did the fantastic evasive manoeuvre to get round that car.
Lawson,
that was a hold your breath moment. But those things used to happen anyway. I mean, when I was working with Kimi in 2003, he smashed into the back of Pisonia at the start in Barcelona because the Jaguar hadn't gotten off the line, and Kimi was starting at the back because he'd gone off the track in qualifying. And he just drove straight into the back of that Jaguar, and that was horrific. But I was more pissed off about the fact that we didn't score the points that we should have done in that race, and he was fine. But so to me, we have some different issues, but these risks were still there before. Maybe there's just a small increase in that risk at the moment, but I don't think it will. I think that will calm down a bit as we get used to the cars. But to me, it's part of Formula One.
Gavin, just switching to you, is there anything specifically on the battery electronic side of operating the cars that is ringing a warning bell in your mind from what you've seen so far?
Nothing that I've seen so far, nothing to be overly concerned about. Like as sort of Mark highlighted, the technical complexity has gone up significantly now in Formula One, which introduces more risks of things going wrong sort of halfway around a corner, like aero, etc. But the safety side has also got so much better that like overall, I think it is still a much safer sport than it ever has been. And like with the battery in particular, like the battery is still relatively small, 20 kilograms. There's going to be so many safety elements in place that I don't think there's any real concerns about like electrocutions or battery thermal runaways actually affecting the driver, no more so than sort of the combustion cars. So, but I think fundamentally it's actually what makes Formula One exciting, right? Is that cars can crash, they can come off at high speed. If there wasn't the risk element, it wouldn't be so exciting to watch. The overtakes are definitely going to introduce a lot more risk, but yeah, I haven't heard any of the drivers complaining significantly about how these new rule changes have changed the safety aspect.
Gav, you mentioned the battery there. Can you just give us an idea of the size of the battery as well? Show us with your
Yeah,
hands, maybe. Measure, just give us an.
it, well, you're talking about 20 kilograms, so you know it's like the weight of a like a plate in the gym. They're going to be full of a lot of aluminium and copper. So there's a lot of metal in a battery that people don't realize. So they're going to be quite dense, but they're still going to be relatively small. I don't know, Mark, if you would know the exact geometric size, but I'd imagine something on the order of like a couple of shoe boxes size of battery.
Yeah, the batteries we had were so basically they fitted into the bottom of the fuel tank. So there was a cavity in the bottom of the car under the fuel tank the battery fitted into. So the width was basically the width of the chassis, and the length was actually similar. They were fairly square, maybe slightly shorter lengthways than widthways, just to fit into the package. And that was one thing I was interested in, to be honest, given that we've changed the power demands on these batteries. I did wonder if they were going to have to get so the battery swing's the same, but the energy recovery and deployment is significantly greater. I did wonder if that was going to have a physical influence on the battery themselves. Do they have to get bigger, or just because presumably things have to be able to be beefier to cope with that extra power demand? So I guess there must have been some weight increase because of that.
Yeah, I think that's why they made the battery actually bigger for this season. Like the usable energy stayed the same, but the battery pack got much bigger, and that's so that it can actually accept the much higher currents. Because yeah, batteries are sort of governed by this thing called C rate, which kind of normalizes the current for the capacity. And the C rates are very extreme now in Formula One. So by having a much bigger battery, it allows it to reduce the C rate, which keeps like the thermals, the electrical current flow, much easier to manage. So I think that's like the main reason that she increased the size of the battery pack was to deal with these much higher peaks in terms of power.
So, Gavin, big question then. Where are we at with Honda right now, do you think? What do you imagine they're working on battery-wise, and how are they
Yeah.
able to solve this given what they may or may not be allowed to do with the regulations, within the regulations? And what
Yeah,
is
I
the real
wouldn't.
problem? Is it overheating, or what is it, do you think?
Yeah, it's almost certainly not a chemistry issue of the battery. It seems to be like some sort of harmonic vibration issue across the whole chassis that's then actually infecting all the other components, like the battery. Like the battery has so many individual components. You think all the coolant connectors, all the electrical connections, and if you put extreme vibration through electrical connectors and coolant connectors, things are going to leak. They're going to become disconnected, etc. Like the actual battery pack itself and the cells and the chemistry inside, they're going to be solidly wedged together. So I don't suspect vibration would affect them too much, but I think it's all the auxiliary components and the control systems that would be more affected. I haven't heard any reports of the vibration specifically coming from the battery. That would be super unusual. But
And do you think overheating is an issue as well?
yeah, overheating is definitely going to be an issue for a lot of the teams, especially as the batteries start to degrade. Because as batteries degrade, they actually produce more heat. So as we go through the season, we're going to see the batteries' performance taper off, the heat generation go up. So it'll be interesting to see if that's going to be noticeable for us viewers, how the actual performance of the cars changes through the season. I think they do get to replace the battery halfway through. So it'll be interesting to see if like when they actually replace their batteries, do we see like an increase now in performance? But yeah, that's something to be factored in.
And just going back to your previous point about it more likely being the ancillaries around the battery, is that therefore within the remit of the battery supplier manufacturer to solve that, or is that more of an Aston Martin issue, do you think? Assuming that harmonic vibration is an Aston Martin issue, well, I don't know, is it or is it not? I guess it is, sort of. But let's talk about the ancillaries and fixing those ancillaries. What do you mean by the ancillaries? Do you mean like connections?
Yeah, like a lot of the connections inside the battery, you're still going to have a lot of connections, a lot of seals, a lot of plates, etc. So I think it's going to be part and parcel. They're going to have to work together to solve it, whatever the issues are caused by. But yeah, there's obviously the external connections, which are probably managed by Aston Martin, but then there's all the internal connections, wiring, coolant flows, etc. So yeah, it's very difficult to tell without having much insight right into the actual cause of the problems. I'm sort of just wildly speculating as to like potential causes.
But Mark, what is your? I mean, can you just refresh us on what they're able to do? They can't actually change the manufacture of the battery at this stage, can they?
No, I think that once they've signed a deal with a supplier, then they're locked into that supplier, and I believe that supplier has to be available to other teams as well, presumably on a contractual basis. So I don't think they're allowed to have exclusivity on a battery supplier, bearing in mind that it's unlikely that any of the named PU suppliers are actually making the batteries themselves. So I think it's very likely that Mercedes, Ferrari, Honda have individual suppliers for their batteries. And we know that Honda used to have batteries supplied by McLaren, even when the Honda was being used by Red Bull and VCARB. I'm not 100% aware of how much. For instance, I'm intrigued by how much technology variation in the batteries themselves there is between one manufacturer and another, because we have very tight controls on engine regulations. For instance, the cylinders have to be round and things like that. But I don't know whether that sort of degree of control is exerted over the non-mechanical parts of the powertrain. So I don't know how different a battery might be from one supplier to another, and maybe Gavin has some information on that.
Yeah, I haven't seen any rules that stipulate in too much detail. Like when it comes to batteries, there's a whole lot you can change, but it's mainly down at the electrochemical level. So the batteries, if they were all on a table, they might all look the same. And when you take them apart, half of them might look the same as the other half, but inside they're going to be very, very different. And this is maybe where there's going to be a bit of rules catch up in the future. Like as a society, we still have very limited understanding of how batteries fundamentally work down at that electrochemical level. It's not like a combustion engine where it's, actually a very known and sort of solved problem now, where we can actually define like very specific things about them. So I think there's going to be a lot more variance in the batteries than you'd ever have seen in the engines. But I'm sure over time that will converge and rules will come in to just make it like a fair level playing field.
It would be fascinating to know whether or not Honda are using, whether they've done their own battery, unlikely from what we're all saying, whether it's a Japanese supplier or whether it's a Chinese supplier. I'd only ask that on the context of it being the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend, and the public are going to be watching Honda very closely, I suspect. Any thoughts on that? I mean, you said in the last time we spoke, Gavin, that most of the big battery suppliers, cell manufacturers are Chinese, right?
Yeah, well, most of the battery technology in the world is Chinese. Most of the understanding of how batteries work is actually with China at the moment. There is a number of Western, very high performance cell manufacturers that can create like really exotic chemistries. Like SAFT is a big one in the US, and A123 is another one. So there is Western companies that have like extreme high performance batteries and that comes from like military applications and stuff like that. But if you look at actually who knows the most about batteries and who makes the best batteries in the world, it's definitely the Chinese at the moment. They just have 20 years of empirical development data behind them. So it'd be interesting to know actually if the batteries are coming from China or if they're coming from the West, and sort of what technology they're using, and where does that technology originate from? Is that automotive technology that's being pushed to the extreme limits, or is that like defense and space technology that's sort of been brought down into motorsport?
Might be some questions you could ask at your forum conference today. There might be somebody there that actually knows the answer to that.
Yes, well, maybe I can come back with some answers after the next few days.
Yeah. Let's see what inside track we can get on that one. It's a fascinating thing, only because it's such a new technology to Formula One, and very few people, teams, groups actually know the answers to any of these problems. It's it's a long time since we've been in this sort of situation about a component as fundamental to the performance of the car as obviously the battery is these days. I don't know how much more time you've got, Gavin, but I just wanted to ask you as well, if I may, before you duck out, whether you think we're going to see different sorts of racing, and I'm going to put racing in inverted commas here, at Suzuka, for example, compared with China. I don't know how familiar or not you are with Suzuka Circuit. I mean, it is an iconic driver's circuit, turn one, a brilliant corner. 130i, not so much so because it's easy flat, but he says the two Degnas, downhill right-handers, very, very impressive. But how much are we going to see? Are we going to see side-by-side, do you think? A lot of side-by-side racing, if that's the right word, in Suzuka this weekend?
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be very interesting now that we've had a weekend off. The drivers have probably had a chance to get back in the sim, take all the learnings from the first two races, improve the car models, actually practice more on the circuits, practice the racing, the overtaking, etc. in the simulator. So yeah, I've got no idea. Maybe Mark, you know the circuit probably better than most people. What do you think?
I think it's more difficult around Suzuka than it was around Shanghai, I suspect. I mean, because the first sector, you've got an overtaking opportunity entering through turn one into turn two. Circuit's reasonably wide there, and power differentials, aerodynamic differential is going to make a difference. Braking performance is going to make a big difference into there. Then you've got the whole first sector is very it's twisty. I think it's going to be difficult for cars to be side by side in that area until they come out of, I think it's turn 9, is it? Where before the track goes under the bridge and follows up to the hairpin. So acceleration out of that right-hander going under the bridge is going to be crucial. Potentially some overtaking on power into the hairpin, but it's not a very long straight, so it might be tricky to do that. And then you've got another, shall we call it, it's an overtaking opportunity up to Spoon, which is the double apex fast left-hander that leads onto the longest straight. But that's a long curving corner. With the old cars, it was very difficult to follow through and into Spoon, but I think with these cars, maybe if you can accelerate more quickly out of the hairpin, and then with the nature of these cars being a little bit kinder to each other aerodynamically, you could get cars side by side into Spoon, but obviously not all the way through the corner. It's very high speed. And then you've got the very long straight, but you're entering that straight from a high speed, so any difference in sort of power delivery is going to have less an effect there, just because the cars aren't accelerating so dramatically. Going side by side through 130R these days is sadly not as exciting as it used to be, because they realigned the corner to give more runoff area. And while the cars have less downforce now than they used to have, that it will be a bit more on the limit, but I suspect there's still probably going to be quite flat through there. And then you've got the classic overtaking opportunity into the chicane, which hasn't really changed over the years. That's going to be where a lot of overtaking happens, I'd imagine. But that's largely going to come down to the braking again, rather than from acceleration. So I think, but then coming out of the chicane, power differentials are going to have a big effect. So I suspect we're going to see maybe a little bit less dependency on the power side of things than Shanghai, maybe a bit more like Melbourne, I suppose. But it's all relative. It's a fantastic circuit. It's one of my favourites. To engineer a car around there was always a supreme challenge. And it's proper old school stuff, and the drivers definitely get a kick out of doing well there, and it's supremely frustrating when your car's not working around there. So I think there'll be a bit more emphasis on car balance this weekend, and any car that's struggling with mid-core understeer is going to pay a big price on this track.
Yeah, we all love Suzuka, and amazing to think that it was actually designed by John Hugenholtz, who also designed Zandvoort. And because Zandvoort was such a great circuit, when the Japanese, and specifically Honda, decided to do a track, they thought, oh, what's the best circuit? Oh, we'll get Zandvoort. Who designed Zandvoort? We'll get him over. And he did Suzuka. So there you go. Really good that Honda did that. A couple of quick questions, Gavin, then we'll definitely let you go. AutoDoc 911, do the batteries have to only contain chemical batteries, or can they also use capacitors?
I think it will be electrochemical, mainly because capacitors don't have the same energy density.
Right.
So a lithium-ion battery has about 10 times the energy density of a supercapacitor. So they're almost certainly going to be lithium-ion electrochemical batteries.
Okay, here's a good question, also from AutoDoc 911. How much degradation of the battery is there per race? In other words, will McLaren be way ahead in the next race because they didn't use them in China? Will that actually have an effect?
That's a good point. So the batteries over 10 races degrade by 20%. So you're talking about a couple of percent of performance per race. So it'd be interesting that, yeah, now McLaren actually have fresher batteries. They might choose to save that in the bank, not for this race, but for a race in 3, 4 races time, where they actually want to push the battery a little bit more to the extreme, incur a bit more degradation in that race. So I think that's something we spoke about in the last podcast, which was teams could actually save some of that battery performance through the season for particular circuits that they thought best to actually push the battery to a little bit more extremes on. So that's not something that I don't think we've ever had in Formula One, where you can actually have this sort of through season optimization of performance for different races and different circuits. So it'll be interesting to see how that shapes out.
Bob says, will the batteries explode like they do often on hybrid road cars?
Hopefully not. That is extremely rare. That's like a 1 in a million chance in a road car. So statistically, probably not in Formula One.
Yeah. And let's just, final thing from Retro Gamer, let's just talk a little bit about this harmonic vibration and whether there is something that, the teams might be adopting across the board, maybe to solve this sort of issue. AHF's active harmonic filters in the power system, maybe. Good idea.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Yeah. I guess it depends where the harmonics are coming from, right? It could be anywhere from suspension to aero to powertrain. Could be the inverter and like the very high frequency MOSFETs inducing vibration. Could be just a traditional engine spinning, etc. So I guess the first thing is identifying where it's coming from, and then two, how do you solve it? But yeah, there's lots of clever techniques to actually solve vibration and harmonics. But the fact that this is such a big issue, I think screams to the size of the problem that they have ahead of them. Like, how do they re-engineer that so quickly?
Yeah. Gav, thanks so much for your time, buddy. And I know how early in the morning it is for you. I know you've just got off a long haul flight as well, and for you to make the effort to do this, really grateful for that. Thanks so much for joining us. It's brilliant. Yeah, if you can just sign out of Zoom there, that'll be brilliant. And I'll just continue a little bit more with some more questions with Mark. But all the best today at the conference. Let us know if there's any significant info that comes out of that.
Yeah, will do. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much, Peter. Mark.
Okay.
Cheers.
Pleasure. Right. There's an interesting question, Mark, on how did everybody get to find out about Mercedes metallurgy and the compression ratio thing? It's a good point, isn't it? I suppose, we all have to assume that there was somebody who was at Mercedes who went to a different power unit supplier, right?
I think that's the most likely thing, yeah, because they've obviously been working on this for quite a long time. I mean, I imagine that they've got the engine's probably been, the design of the engine's probably 2 or 3 years old. So, yeah, I think it's most likely that it's personnel change. Because in my experience, people who work within teams will not divulge information whilst they're still working for that team. It's always pretty amazing how tight things are managed to be kept within teams, I think.
Yeah. And we've been talking about this next question quite a lot already. Hi, Peter and Mark and Gavin. Do you know whether it's a given that all the teams have been able to easily achieve the full 350 kilowatt with the electric motor without sacrificing much of a weight penalty? And I think we're all collectively quite surprised that they have. There doesn't seem to be any team that's suffering in that area, would you say?
Well, we've had, certainly the rumours are that the Williams is quite significantly overweight. And I think Andrea Stella commented that the McLaren, they aren't completely clear on weight. So maybe there are more issues with that than we thought. So it was interesting, Gavin, mentioning that how much bigger the batteries have got. That wasn't something I was aware of. So that definitely will have been a problem. And I think this is one of the reasons why the cars are only, 15 kilos lighter.
Yeah.
Even though they're shorter wheelbase, so there's just less of the car, and the MGUK has come off the car. They're actually not much lighter, and most of that 15 kilo
MGUH off the car, right?
Yeah, MGUH off the car has saved some weight, but obviously they've had to put weight on because of the power demands from the higher charge and recovery rates. That most of that 15 kilos came from lighter wheels and tyres. That's one of the main reasons they went for the smaller tyres. So the cars themselves are not much lighter. So yeah, it sounds like, and we know that teams were even struggling the previous generations to get underweight. So yeah, it sounds like that might be more of a problem, and it's just starting to come out who might have problems with that over others.
Yeah. Changing the subject to Williams, there's a question about the whole thing, how confusing it is really, because last year James Vowles kept saying all our focus is on 2026, and now they've got an overweight car that doesn't seem to be going very well. What is going on? This is from JPS 78 MA Mario Andretti. It's a good point. I actually asked Claude the other day why the Williams was going so slowly, and Claude blamed legacy production systems within the factory, production system problems within the factory, which implies, says Claude, that the way they used to build their monocoques and chassis and all the other parts were not in keeping with what they needed to be doing in 2026. But it seems if Claude's got that right, why didn't he tell James Vowles a couple of years ago about that? See, I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but I mean, what do you make of all that, Mark?
It's not entirely surprising because for teams to move forward is quite tricky unless they have personnel variation. So when a team will learn something new, and then someone from that team will go to another team and take that technology or that advance with them. That's normally how things work. And so when you've got a team that's not doing as well and is on a tight budget, as Williams certainly were within the last few years, obviously that makes them less attractive for people to go to, because maybe their salaries aren't so great. People like to move to teams that are more successful. So it's kind of a natural thing that the teams that are struggling tend to also struggle in terms of keeping up with technology. And the teams that are doing well, so Red Bull, Mercedes, particularly McLaren, it's not a surprise that as they attract people with more knowledge into their teams, they move forward at a faster rate. That's kind of always been the case. And it certainly, the Williams issue of production has been brought up before, hasn't it? When they were running out of cars, I can't remember which season, was that 24, when they didn't have enough cars to do second or third race?
Excuse me, I just touched my mobile phone. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah. What was the question?
So Williams was it 24 when they didn't have enough chassis because they had quite a lot of shunts early in the season?
Well, when they failed to take a spare monocoque to the Australian Grand Prix, exactly that. Exactly that. Not good.
It's a design issue, isn't it? It's fundamentally, it comes down to design. They haven't got people with the latest knowledge of how to design the cars, and they haven't got the latest technology in terms of the manufacture of the carbon in the factory. So it's all those elements that need to come together, and you either need the people who do that design to learn the new technologies, which is very hard given the timeframes we've got, or you have to bring in new people with that knowledge. And to do that, you need to entice them away from someone who already has that knowledge. And to do that, you need more money, and to provide them with a more attractive working environment. And as I say, that's difficult for a team towards the back of the grid to do. But it kind of shows a level of ambition within a team, doesn't it? When they do have that, when they are able to do that.
Yeah, and actually, what you're saying is all credit to Alpine for doing as well as they are at the moment. Really.
They certainly struggled with the weight, didn't they,
Mm.
a couple of years ago? And as far as we know, they've moved forward in that area. So they've
Yeah.
obviously done some good work in that region. Yeah,
Yep.
it's the nature of the business.
Right.
Always. Remember when Harvey went to Ferrari and did the first proper monocoque Ferrari in '82? Because up until '82, their cars had been space frames with aluminium over the top.
Mm.
Proper honeycomb chassis to
Mm.
Ferrari, which had been the norm at other teams since sort of '79. So it's not a new thing. It's just something that you have to do if you're going to
Yeah.
compete, to bring new technology and new techniques forwards.
Yeah, I haven't got fond memories of that '82 car, of course, because of both Gilles and Pironi. And Gilles, of course, the seatbelt mounting points pulled out of the back of the cockpit area, so that was not good. Right, we'll quickly get through some questions, which I'll share with you, Mark. Zishan Asfar, thank you very much. Another of our regulars. Peter, do you think Kimi Antonelli can actually challenge George this season, or is it mainly track dependent, and has George mainly got him covered by a tenth or two? Well, my response to that is what we saw in China was a function of George not having a proper run in Q3, not being on the pole, and therefore it all fell away from him there because his race thereafter was kind of dumbed down. Obviously, things could have gone better, particularly if Kimi had made a bad start. But there you go. He was on the pole, clean side of the grid, and that was it. And I think for me, Kimi has actually got a little bit over George on very slow corners, going into slow corners, not necessarily breaking into slow corners, but in slow corners. I think he's really good. That's his strong area. But I think George has got him on medium and high speed corners. Slow speed change of direction, chicanes about the same. Medium speed change of direction, I'd say George has him. So over a season, probably George, but expect Kimi to win more races, particularly circuits like Monaco. He'll be really quick, in my opinion. I don't know what you think about that, Mark.
I think you've nailed it. I think that win was Kimi did a fantastic job, but he benefited from George having issues which held him back, and the fact that George Russell was able to catch up as much as he did during the race, even though he had less good tyres, shows that he actually had a speed advantage, just wasn't enough to recover the difference. So you're spot on about the medium speed corners in particular. George has a very good handle on those, and as one of his sort of strong areas. I would add to that tyre management. George is probably second only to Max in terms of tyre management, knowing how to do lift and coast, where to push the tyres, where to get the most out of them. And he's a very smart driver, isn't he? He's thinking constantly in the car. He's adding to Mercedes' strategy quality by being such a smart driver. And from the little we've heard from on the radio, I don't think Kimi Antonelli is in a position to add as much as George does in that respect. So I'd say we're going to see Antonelli improving, no doubt. This is only his second year of Formula One, so it's pretty impressive that he's won a race already. But I think George Russell has all the attributes to maintain an advantage over Kimi, unless he has to face bigger challenges, as we saw in Shanghai.
Yep, good point. Very good point about the time management. We've made that several times, and I did neglect to say that. And that started to show up in George's driving in Formula 2. I mean, he was all over Jack Aitken at ART. Very similar in lap time periodically, but George could just extend that into the race distances, and amazing how good he was with time management even then. Next question from Rick Dale. Hi, Rick. Hi, Peter. How long do you think Jim Clark would have continued to race, obviously without his accident? He'd already started discussions with Colin Chapman about buying the Beagle Aircraft Company, a very small but interesting aircraft company. And I think Jimmy would have done that. I think he obviously would have raced in 68. I think he would have won the championship in 68. I'm not sure he would have raced in 69. I think he probably would have retired at the end of 68. And it's interesting, he would have retired just before all that, the high wings came into vogue, and he would have, I think he would have been as horrified as Jochen Rindt and everybody else by the danger of those high wings. And probably that end of that 68 season would have been, his last year in Formula One. So yeah, interesting question. Thank you very much for that. Warfun, slowing down in corners makes driving the cars so much easier. It takes away so much control and bravery necessary to drive quickly. Yeah, I'll hand over to Mark in a second. My take on that would be, I've never seen bravery as a key part of a great driver's repertoire. It's always anticipation and warning the car what's going to happen next. And if you do have to drive on reflexes and reactions more than you are by anticipation and manipulation, inevitably you're going to make an error at some point, and you're going to back away from that error. Whereas a manipulative driver is always going to be aware that the car's different every corner, every lap, for a number of reasons, and he's always going to be adapting to that. So that said, I agree with you that I think if a corner, let's say turn 10 in or turn 9 section 10 section in Melbourne, is approached at 330 kilometers an hour down to, say, I don't know what it is, 260, then it's a much more, one of the arts of great driving is to be able to get to 260 as quickly as possible, if you see what I mean. Whereas if you're suddenly at 260, 50 meters before you go into the corner, that skill is gone. And that's what drivers like Max and Charles and Lewis at his very best, and a few others, do extremely well. They extend the straight, and they can extend that sort of 360 a little bit further than a driver who breaks in a straight line. And that is gone away from a corner like that. And I fear that that's what will happen going into turn 1 at Suzuka, that essence will go away, assuming they are super clipping down pit straight, which I suspect they will be. And I suspect also that will be the case going into the first Degner as well, which will therefore make the first Degner much less daunting and much less of a demanding corner in which you have to feel the car from lap to lap on exactly how quickly you can go in there, because it's always an understeery entry there. So yeah, that would be my take. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding amongst the sort of spectators to how much slower the drivers are going in. It's not like they're going slower all the way up to the apex. So particularly with lift and coast, what they're doing is they're lifting off on the straight before hitting the brake pedal. And whereas in the past they'd be hitting the brake pedal exactly as they came off the throttle, or sometimes even hitting the brake pedal slightly before coming off the throttle if they wanted to improve stability. So what you're doing is you're knocking the corner off. So where the car speed would be gradually increasing up, if a very long straight, obviously flattening, and then suddenly dropping when they hit the brakes. Now there's like a region where they come off the throttle, the speed trace drops at a slower rate than it would do if they were braking as well. Then they still have to hit the brakes, and you kind of have to hit the same trajectory that you would be before. And you're still maximizing the car's lateral grip capability, particularly from the rear, all the way up to the apex. So I would argue that whilst that sudden transition from high speed to slowing down isn't quite as abrupt, the ability to manage the grip perfectly whilst transitioning from full throttle to off throttle but not braking, and then to full braking, is at least as difficult, if not more difficult, for the driver to manage. And certainly what we saw with drivers in the past was that the technique of lift and coast is not something that all drivers are able to, they're not all as effective at. You have to kind of be like a metronome at hitting the correct braking point, having lifted off some point before. And sometimes the teams are telling the drivers, we need to do more lift and coast, or we need to do left lift and coast. So in a race, from lap to lap, they might have to be managing that braking point after the lift phase. And that's actually quite difficult to do something different from lap to lap. So bear in mind, they're also having to manage tyre grip variation as well. So whilst it's not obvious to spectators, the drivers are still having to manage that trying to optimize the lateral longitudinal grip balance, and it is varying from lap to lap, corner to corner as well. So I don't think that the driver skill level is being reduced. It's being tested in a different way. And the only place I do think that we are seeing some reduction of that is, as I've said already, into turn 9 in Melbourne, they were clearly having to lift off early. And so that meant that the car wasn't being pushed to its absolute limit on the first part of the entry. But the driver still had to get to the fastest way of driving that car through the rest of the corner. So I don't think it's not like they're just cruising into the corners completely. So I think that's a bit of a misconception.
What I would say in response is, whenever I talk about these things, when I talk about Max and Charles and Lewis at his best and a few others, I'm never ever thinking in terms of the lift and coast situations, which for me are part of racing, which is a completely different thing to the perfect lap in qualifying. That's what I'm talking about. And if they lift and coast on the perfect lap in qualifying prior to this year, I'd be very surprised. And so that's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm only talking about situations when you're on the absolute limit. Lift and coast is not on the menu. It is, of course, this year, but it wasn't last year in qualifying, I don't think. And then it is all about absolutes, and it is all about exchange of throttle to brake and steering load against all those things. But I've got a question for you, Mark, on what you were just saying there, because I get completely what you're saying, and it all makes perfect sense, except for one thing. At turn 7 in China, they were going in, kind of accelerating in towards the, for want of a better word, apex, and then mid corner, the clipping was coming in, and they were just suddenly losing speed and power in mid corner of turn 7. They're going like that. They're going, oh, mid corner. And that's where you saw Gasly on the outside of Verstappen in turn 7. The cameras didn't really catch it. And everybody was aghast. What is going on? How can Pierre Gasly pass Max Verstappen on the outside of turn 7? Of course, the answer is that at that moment, he's not on the limit, and he's not generating maximum possible lateral G that he could be generating in a normal situation. If he hadn't suddenly lost power mid corner and they're just droning around side by side. That is my point.
Yeah, I'm not completely disagreeing with that. There is an element of that.
Well, more than an element, it's an outside pass by Pierre Gasly over Max Verstappen, which is a huge thing.
But Max must have not been able to maximise the entry speed for that car to get alongside him. I mean, you can't go around turn 7 where the track grip is less unless you have some sort of advantage over the car in front.
No, but all Max was doing, I was on board, he's absolutely flat into 7 as he would have been in any given year. It is a flat entry. That's what makes it a great corner. They're going in 7th gear, I think, or 6th. And he's flat in, and as he's turning the wheel, he's still on the throttle, and the engine note just drops. And at that point, the car for sure is slowing. And that is the moment when Gasly goes boom like that round the outside of him. Now, you could say, well, that shows the Alpine has got more is taking out less speed. But ultimately, it's all to do with the engine losing power mid-corner.
But the only things I can say to that was we saw that Hadjar was actually having to lift through 7 because the car didn't have enough grip compared to other cars. So that was in qualifying. He was actually occasionally having to lift. Max wasn't, because presumably he was doing a slightly better job of it, or his car had more grip. So to me, it looked like the Red Bull was struggling in turn 7 from a car performance point of view anyway. So maybe one of the reasons Gasly was able to get alongside was because his car at that point was just in better shape and he had more speed capability than Max. The other thing I would say is that from the onboards we saw, which weren't many, but you didn't actually see the battery level going up dramatically through that corner. So it looked to me more like the drivers were lifting. It wasn't a question of super clipping that I could see. You know, the driver wasn't at full throttle and the battery level was going up that I saw at any time. So to me, that's more a question of whatever reason the driver's lifting off at that point. I don't know why. Maybe they were doing lift and coast into the following corner, but the cars were slowing down because they couldn't go as fast as they used to be able to through that corner up to the apex. So to me, it's not entirely a question of super clipping. I think there's a grip level thing going on there as well.
No, I have to disagree there. From what I saw, I mean, maybe but there's so many things you could look at, but yeah, I mean, I don't think the Red Bull was a particularly easy car to go into 7 with flat, but you could get into 7 flat, and you went into 7, and mid corner the power drops, and now if that power is dropping because he's not got enough grip, in theory, it would go up again when he's found the grip on the exit of 7, but it just went, oh, and then it stays that way, and it stays that way all into the entry to 8, which suggests that it is nothing but regeneration of power. Now, whether we accurately were allowed to see exactly what the batteries were doing there, I don't know. I didn't see many battery graphics coming up at any stage, so I can't really comment on that. But to me, it was all about power generation. That in the middle of 7, it was just like get into 7 flat, then we'll have clipping going on, whatever you want to call it, and that was the moment when they were going around side by. The only example, I think we had Lewis and Charles side by side there as well, didn't we?
Turn 7, they were arriving into turn 7 faster than the previous generation of cars because of the acceleration out of 6.
Yeah.
And then they've got less downforce than they had before, so they have to go slower through the corner.
But none of them are lifting going into 7. None. All of them were flat into 7. All of them. They were still accelerating.
The car speed was dropping because they've got less grip, so they're scrubbing off more speed. Right. They have less downforce and they've got less tyre grip because the tyres are smaller.
It was all dropping on all the cars at exactly the same place, basically within the margin of how they were dropping in Melbourne going into various corners. Anyway, that's a good argument. We'll see what happens into 1 at Suzuka then. We'll continue this one, eh? I think. I
mean, they were lift and coasting from 7 into the next corner. They were doing
absolutely, yeah. But what do you mean by 7? That's the point. You know, is it 7 to me is all about the entry. Once you're in 7. As you say, there's no room on the outside. The track's too dirty. Once you're into 7, if you've made it, you're okay there. But that's when they're all lifting off. Once they're into 7, nobody was lifting off into 7. They were lifting off once they were there, mid corner. Yeah, well, you know, that's how Pierre Gasly was able to get alongside Max Verstappen in 7, because he had
a better car. His tyres were probably in better shape.
Well,
the Red Bull is struggling in high speed.
Yeah.
We saw one of the reasons why it's slower.
I don't think I'm not going to put my hand up and say the Red Bull is a brilliantly great car, but I'd be shocked if it doesn't have as much downforce as an Alpine. I mean, we were saying after Melbourne that the one thing Alpine seem to lack is downforce and sheer grip. And here they are passing a Red Bull on the outside because they got a grip advantage at 7.
Max was graining his tyres. We saw the Red Bull was graining tyres.
This was lap 3 or 4 when he was, very early in the race.
He was on softs, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
And grained them more easily than...
Long before the softs had grained. Long before. He was still quite quick after that, relatively quick.
I think we are playing too much on the energy recovery issue. There are car differences. The Red Bull is not as good a car this year as it was last year relative to the other cars. The Mercedes is a better car relative to other cars than it was last year. It's not all down to powertrains. It's somewhat down to car performance as well.
I think the jury's out on that. I will continue to slightly disagree with the great master.
I'm just going by the fact is
the
batteries weren't going up.
Well, you race engineers can be quite annoying sometimes because you're usually right, and that's what's annoying about you all. And you're too clinical, and yeah, I know. You got to have a bit more romanticism, I think, Mark.
I'm one of the most romantic people about these things, but at the end of the day, facts are facts.
Well, they are facts, and eyes are eyes, and visuals are visuals, and it's not for nothing. And it's nothing to do with sour grapes, because he also qualified this by saying, and I would be saying this even if I was in a Merc. And I've said several times, I think Max was in a Merc. I don't think he'd be blowing George away. I think it'd be close, but I don't think he'd be Max Verstappen showing his mastery, because I think these cars even things out a lot. But for Max to say this is not real racing is quite a big thing. And why would he say that? He would say that because he's just been unbelievably annoyed by being passed on the outside by Pierre Gasly into 7. That's what would have prompted that, in my opinion. And if that's the case, I'm prepared to look at why that would be. And I've looked at all the onboards, and he's sitting there, and you can just hear the engine note drop. And as it drops, there's the pink Alpine on the outside of him. And that's nothing to do with grip. He hasn't got understeer, he hasn't got oversteer, hasn't got lost the rear. He's just sitting there in a groove, and there's the Alpine going past because he's suddenly going much slower. You can see the speed just drop off. It's 10, 15 kilometers an hour straight away. As soon as he comes out, as soon as the engine dies, and he's flat on the throttle in the middle of 7. Now, maybe it's not so much a grip thing, that the way they have to harvest their energy requires them to do that and sacrifice 7 because they felt they weren't going to lose too much because there's not a long straight afterwards and you're going into 8 anyway. And then the 9 section, there's that to it. But nonetheless, for Formula One to have come up with a situation whereby a Max Verstappen could be passed on the outside on a seemingly impressive overtake, when in reality it's just one car going much slower all of a sudden, the car on the inside, I think is misleading for everyone. That's as I see it.
Yeah, I agree up to a point, but I think more.
Well, that's
I just
a
think
bit
there's
of an
more to
achievement
it.
by me then.
Yeah, but I just think there is more to it, and I think we're going to see the Red Bulls struggle on high-speed corners this year. From what we've seen so far this year, it does look like that's a particular issue for them. So I do think it's possible that the Alpine was actually a better car in that entry to mid-phase, and that gave the opportunity for Gasly to get into that position. Yes, the engine recovery following makes that easier. And it may be that this is one of the disadvantages that Red Bull has, say, compared to Mercedes, is that maybe the Mercedes doesn't have to do as much recovery in that part compared to a Red Bull. Unfortunately, we didn't get many onboards with
They were doing pretty. I mean, obviously the speeds were different, but it was pretty similar to Max. They were using that to recover energy mid corner. Once they're into 7, they were all flat, and then the throttle, and then the engine note was just dying. That's all you can say, really. And obviously everything's relative, but that's one of the areas where they chose to do it. And of course, I say all this under the heading of turn 7 for me was always the best corner in China, because it was a really dramatic entry, blind entry in a way, because it's going uphill, and it's just a great corner, and it was just diluted. I just didn't like that, and I just hope 1A and 1B in Suzuka don't go the same way, or the Degners. That's all I can say.
Yeah,
here's a good question for you, Mark. Change the subject now. Ferrari's tiny wing at the base of their rollover structure, did that do anything? How much downforce was it worth against drag?
It's tiny efficiency numbers, but they're always looking for tiny gains in any area. So even if it was only worth 200ths of a second a lap, it's worth putting on the car, because that's 200ths of a second that you didn't have before. So all these little features that you see on the cars, the changing are tiny amounts, but every step forward is worth having. And most teams will do sort of a cost analysis. They'll have like a thousands of pounds or dollars per millisecond improvement mark, and if something comes through that is justified on that basis, they'll put it on the car, and if something comes through that isn't, they won't bother. That's how it works. So it's all about tiny incremental steps forward in aerodynamic efficiency primarily, and that will be one of them.
There's a good question from Drew. With the cancellation of Bahrain, Saudi, what impact will that have on budget cap?
There hasn't been any talk about it, has there? I think the budget cap is staying the same. So effectively, that means that the teams will have some amount more money available to spend for the rest of the year. But in the grand scheme of things, actually going to a race event and against not going to a race event is, I think it's a relatively small amount of money, because most of the money is spent on design, factory staff, all the salaries, all that side of things. So the saving of not going to a couple of events, whilst it's going to be some amount of money, it's probably not going to be super dramatic. I think the bigger influence is that it takes 2 races out of Mercedes' advantage in terms of engine performance before the changes come in. in June. And so for Mercedes, particularly, but Mercedes powered cars, I think it is particularly problematical. I think that's the biggest effect on it.
Of course, the other issue, a much bigger financial issue, is the contract the circuits have with Formula One and whether they continue to pay Formula One. And then indeed, if you think about the large TV networks that have paid a fortune to Formula One for a 24 race championship, do they get a refund or not? You know, there's all sorts of, or do they get that in kind in something else, more use of footage behind the scenes or whatever? You know, there'll be quite a lot of argy-bargy going on under that one. Of course, Formula One will probably try to extend it as long as possible and say, well, you know, maybe we'll postpone the races, have them later in the year. Talk about it then. That's what I would do if I was their lawyer anyway. Danny London says, oh, typical. Good one, Peter. Danny London was talking about how in turn 16, how good Lewis was into turn 16 in China, all over Charles. Really, really good. The way he was not using the curb, but had angle on the car and just so consistently quick there. And that was welcome back Lewis for me anyway. I thought he drove beautifully, particularly turn 16 entry in China. Really, really good. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, I think there, and 2-3 as well. 1-2-3 was a sequence doing
he
really
was
well.
good. He was good.
Yeah, I just thought it was just really fabulous to see him driving, you know, more of the old Lewis as we saw. I mean, I guess last year it was one of his best weekends as well, wasn't it? He won the sprint race last year.
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping that it's a genuine resurgence in his sort of mindset and form, and not a one-off. I guess we'll hopefully see in Suzuka.
Well, you know, and with these new regs neutralising some of the corners and making it all easier, yeah, I'm only joking, Mark, just winding you up. Don't worry.
Do you know what it is? It's a little bit, again, the graphics in Formula One. They could just do so much better to show people what the drivers are doing. Because when people say the drivers don't matter anymore in motor racing or in Formula One, it's just so wrong. Because they matter so much, they add so much to the overall performance of the teams and their cars, and it's from that super skill level and their mindsets that comes through. And it's so, I guess, Drive to Survive has maybe shown a little bit to people of individual drivers' mindsets, but I just wish people could see the data and those little differences between the drivers that come through. I mean, you can see it visually, which is fantastic, but I think a lot of people don't see it so much. And more onboards and more graphics, more data would just really do a great job of showing what a fantastic job.
Well, I've been campaigning for years and years and years and years, ever since Grand Prix movie came out in 1966 almost, to have proper footwell cams, because that is part of the driver's repertoire. In fact, it's more significant than steering quite often, the throttle and the brakes, and yet we never have them. And as much as I push for it, the answer always is that in order to have proper foot cams, you need proper lighting, and to have proper lighting, you need a certain amount of space in the footwell area, and the teams will never agree to that sort of space in the front of the cars. So forget it. So there we go. No footwell cams, and that's a great shame, I think, because I love watching footwork, love it, and you can see it. Obviously, it's one of the great things. I mean, Max on board around the Nürburgring, footwork, just astonishing, and Aussie V8s really started it all. Good, you know, hats off to them. Vlad3722 says, hi Peter, I was watching the other day the documentary about Gilles Villeneuve. What a story. I was wondering if you'd met him, and Didier Pironi. Indeed, I'd met him. He was one of my best buddies, and we used to have lots of dinners together and hang out with him in Cannes when he lived there, and then in Monaco, and just every race we just spent a lot of time together. And he's very, very lovely guy, but just one of the nicest people I knew. Just loved racing, funny guy, unbelievably quick. I mean, I'll never ever forget driving back from Jacarapagua, the circuit in Rio, to the hotel, and in I think we were in a Fiat 127 or something ridiculous like that, and maybe it was something slightly bigger, 132 maybe. the Brazilian equivalent thereof with its alcohol fuel thing. And Gilles he just never stopped. Traffic light, oh yeah, up on the footpath, mate. Yeah, handbrake turn here. It's just, the whole thing was just a blur it was sort of Terry Neuville meets, I don't know, Gilles Villeneuve, actually. It was just amazing. And, but what a lovely guy. And used to hang out in his motorhome a lot and take your shoes off before you go in, lovely carpet, ice cold milk there ready, chocolate cake periodically. It's very difficult now to talk about Gilles without getting very whimsical and, nostalgic, because for me, he was just the ultimate racing driver in many ways, many, many ways. Pironi, I also knew in his build up to Formula One, and whilst he was driving for Tyrrell and so forth, did a couple of laps with him at Ricard in an Alpine A310 or something like that. Yeah. Pretty quick. Yeah, I always thought he was mega quick. Not quite spiky, sort of George Russell-ish. But yeah, I kind of, I was massively close to Gilles. And so when the whole Imola thing happened in '82, didn't really ever speak to Didier after that. And, I was appalled at what he did there. And of course, that led up to the way Gilles handled qualifying at Zolder, when he had that third set of tyres and he just went for the gap because Jochen Mass in front of him hadn't made it clear which side he wanted to be passed. And at the last minute, Mass just moved over on him. And Gilles had been talking about the potential for that sort of thing to happen, given the pressure you're under with that third set of tyres. And and Bernie and everyone had just said, shut your mouth, get on with it. And it was terrible. Terrible. Anyway, thanks for the question. Here's one for you, Mark. I'm going to enjoy this one. Ashen Shandarawan. Hey guys, what about recharging the batteries in the pits, like refueling they did in the past? Cars can have a big battery and no recharging on track. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's funny because part and parcel of why the IndyCar rules work is because of their pit stops. And I've always thought it's a bit of a shame that we went away from pit stops in Formula One. I think they added a great spectacle and made the strategy much, much more interesting. But obviously now we're heading to the point where you don't need to do pit stops because they've got electricity on board. But yeah, you could do a quick charge, couldn't you, if you came up with the right equipment?
Yeah.
And that could be an interesting thing as well. I think the whole pit stop thing is something we're missing. It would make the races much more interesting.
By which you mean longer pit stops and fewer people on the pit apron? Is that what you mean?
I just mean that having a car that basically can't go the distance without having to do a pit stop, which is what the Indy cars are, and adding the strategy differences between a driver who stretches out against a driver who goes flat out, and just adding that extra element into the mix. I mean, you could reduce the number of people in the pit stop as well to make the pit stops themselves a bit longer, a bit more unpredictable, maybe. But I'm just thinking more about. I like the IndyCar style of racing where the car has to do pit stops, but you can have some cars doing 3 stops, some doing 4 stops, and it just adds that extra element of doubt. And then the whole safety car starts, affecting how those strategies play out. That's one of the things that makes that sort of racing less predictable than we have in Formula One. And I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't have something like that, personally.
Well, I can tell you why we don't. It's because I spoke to Frank Williams about this. I said, when we were talking about pit stops, I said to him once, I think it'd be much better if we only had, 6, 7 people in a pit stop rather than the entire car swarming and 2.5 second, 3 second pit stops. And he said, that'll never happen because those 2.5 second pit stops is Formula One's DNA. That is our selling point throughout the world. That is why we're so much better than IndyCar, because we can do these super quick pit stops. And that's what people love. We'll never change that. That was his response.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, you see.
Yeah. You could do... I think you could still do quick pit stops, but it would be nice to break the races up more and have more variation between what cars are doing, because they are kind of stuck with what we've got now. I mean, everyone keeps saying, wouldn't it be good if we did more pit stops and then we can end up with 1-stop races? Well, it's kind of inevitable unless you force something into it. And you can't, we tried to do more than 1 pit stop at Monaco last year and it just didn't work, did it? Because you've still got the same tyres and you've still got cars that can go to the end on the fuel that they've got. Yeah. You have to add in another element.
Yeah. No.
So
Pretty good for you race engineers as well. Very
well,
good.
yeah, that is more interesting.
The strategy lot. AGTV5. Hi, Peter. I seem to recall on a previous podcast you being rather unimpressed with Ayrton Senna's throttle application. Can you elaborate on the pros and cons of his technique? Well, unimpressed is the right word. I just said it was an idiosyncrasy, and to me that meant that he was, like all human beings, not absolutely perfect. Obviously, whatever he did with the throttle was pretty effective given his results and how quick he was. But it was a weird thing, and he had it right from the start of Formula Ford into Formula 3 and then into Formula 1, long before he ever drove with the turbo engine. And I asked him about it once after he'd won the Macau Formula 3 race, and we were watching the replay together in his house in Reading. And I said, Ayrton, what is all that you're doing? Why are you blipping the throttle like that so much in the mid-corner? And he said, I'm just waiting for the perfect moment to get on the power. And I have to feel that through my right foot. And I like to have a very soft throttle to do that. And I thought, okay, kind of makes sense. And then I thought about, all the great drivers up until that point that I'd seen, and none of them ever did that. They were all, they all could, some of them were a little bit progressive. Some of them just waited till the perfect moment. But none of them blipped at mid-corner like that. And of course, when the turbo era came along and throttle lag became a huge thing, trying to minimize the amount of throttle lag, and when you went to big turbos, small turbos, twin turbos, whatever it was, to get around the problem, Ayrton, that system actually worked very well for Ayrton, because he was kind of building up the boost pressure mid-corner sort of thing in a very progressive way relative to what you could do in those days. And it definitely gave an advantage, I think, in the Honda era against Prost, probably. I say definitely, I think it did. But it was something he did long before turbos, and it was a weird thing that he never ever got over. He just did it. And in a way, you could say, isn't that cool? That he never changed. It was always just his signature. Have you ever known a driver that does that, Mark?
I must admit, I've heard those stories, and I've always struggled to understand how it could be used at all, because one of the typical problems you get with the drivers even now is that they'll tend to go on the throttle a bit too much too early, and then complain about understeer. And yes, they want to be getting on the throttle earlier, and if the car could take it and accelerate out of the corner on the correct line, that would be great. But what tends to happen is they just induce understeer because the front end of the car can't take it. So it's very difficult to understand. And then, well, you've got the other thing is, if the car does understeer, then there's a tendency to want to break that understeer by aggressively applying the throttle, which can work momentarily, but tends to lead to the rear tires going off more quickly. So it's something you might be able to do in qualifying, but not in the race. So it's the alternative to driving over the inside curb to make the rear swing round a bit. And one place that Lewis was absolutely brilliant at that was in Bahrain, turn 10, the very sharp left-hander onto that middle straight. He absolutely destroyed Fernando Alonso through there, because he could just perfectly time his throttle application to bring the rear of the car round, to straighten the car up and get on the power earlier than Fernando. Fernando was always waiting to get on the throttle there, but Lewis would just flick the rear round. But it's a very, very difficult thing to do well. And if you're jabbing at the throttle, aren't you just either inducing understeer or oversteer without the car actually wanting to do that at that moment? I never understood that, and it only made sense with the turbo lag, as you said to me.
Yeah, I can't ever say that Ayrton jabbed at the throttle. I got listening to it. There was something silky smooth to the way he was doing it. It never felt ba 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 ba. It was never like that. It was, it was. You could hear it, but you could tell maybe he wasn't coming right out of the throttle either. I mean, he was just modulating it, but it was, the engine note was there, going up and down, and so it was fascinating to hear you talk about Lewis at turn 10, because I'm probably going to bore everybody here and repeat something, but I've always felt that 9, 10 and Bahrain was one of the best bits of road in Formula 1, but I always include 9 in that because of the following story. I was on the outside of turn 10, between 9 and 10, during testing in 07 in Lewis's first year. Is that right? Would it have been that year? Or anyway, the first year he went to Bahrain, and I was and then within a few laps, I was completely astonished at how wide Lewis was going through turn 9, and there were marbles coming up from the right hand outside of the car as he was going through 9, this really quick kink, really quick, which I think is 6th gear. And I don't know what it would have. Yeah, I think it would have been about 6 then, and flat, but on the edge. And I just thought, he's obviously running out of road a bit there. He's not sort of using the apex like Fernando and anybody else at that point. And I stayed there and watched, and he continued to do it. And I suddenly twigged at what he was doing. He was coming through a little bit wider through 9 and living with this moment of being on the edge of the marbles through 9 at very high speed, purely because he wanted to have a lovely little area where he could get the car stopped perfectly for 10 and rotate it into 10, and exactly what you just said, that beautiful power application out of 10, knowing how important 10 is, because it's got that long straight afterwards, and the last thing you need is an inside front locking up or a little bit of understeer or the back end jinking a bit. And he was preventing all of that happening by what he was doing through 9. And that's why I've always thought that's such a great bit of road. And a lot of drivers do that now. And I remember talking to Jarno Trulli about that when he was at Toyota and saying, I was watching Lewis, and this is what he does. If you're in the race and you're in traffic, just do what Lewis does, and for sure the guy in front will make a mistake at some point into 10, or you'll run a bit wide, and you'll pass people just by doing exactly what I just described. And Jarno did that, and he passed about 4 cars. I think he found 3rd or 4th in that race. And afterwards he came up and he said, turn 9, 10, unbelievable, thank you, Lewis. And I think he set the absolute gold standard of what to do there now. And sadly, it's kind of gone away this year. Again, it wasn't quite as, you couldn't really do that into 9 anymore because they were coming out of the throttle, the car was slowing down. So it was less demanding. And the cars had less grip anyway, so they were all going slower and they're all clunking down through the gears. But at that moment, Mark, thanks for mentioning that, because it's amazing, actually, how we both saw that. You saw it from an engineer's perspective, and Lewis through there was just absolutely superb. A couple of questions, I'll just read them through, and we won't necessarily respond. This is from Navi Tiger Racing. The new regs and the 26 cars are garbage. It's artificial racing, no longer the pinnacle of motorsport when drivers can't push into the corners or braking. Autodoc 911 says the battery is way too small to have a single charge last more than a couple of turns, and says if they had bigger batteries, something like in pit recharging, even if only from the car itself, would make undercuts better. It's kind of agreeing with what we said about the pit stops, what you were just saying, Mark, there. TRJ Whiteley says, Peter and Mark, can we expect the McLarens to make up ground on the back of the upcoming 4-week break? Can you give a shout out to my friend Karen too? Big fan of yours. Thanks. Yeah, well, big shout out to Karen. It's going to be an interesting 4-week break, isn't it? Because it's a long time since Formula One's had a mid-season break in which they're actually allowed to work on the cars and development and design, right?
Yeah, it's really strange. Because we weren't expecting this to happen. So obviously the teams have developments going on, and they can't just bring in new developments because they've suddenly got a break. It might mean that they're able to push some things through a bit more quickly than they would have done otherwise, because they're not having to service the cars and make parts just for going racing. So it's possible that some teams will be able to bring in a development that was already planned a bit earlier than they thought they were going to beforehand. So it might do that.
Right, good point. Sorry.
I was just going to say, really, though, it's just a really good break for the people who are travelling, because they've been on it since the end of, January. They've been on the road. And by this point of the year, I know we've only done 2 races, but you're starting to feel quite fried already, because you've actually done your shakedown tests, 2 tests at Bahrain. You've done a triple header, effectively. It's so tough on the personnel, not the drivers and not the team principals, because they've got their private jets and go to nice hotels and get to sit around. But for the engineers and mechanics, for those guys, I can't. It's a blessed relief, to be honest, that they're going to have this opportunity, and it'll mean they're fresher for the upcoming races, so they'll be more on it than the races afterwards.
So it won't hurt McLaren having this break, that's for sure. But they wouldn't be able to maximize it as much as they would if they'd known the break was going to come in the first place, is what we're basically saying.
I think that's the main thing I'm saying, yeah. But they might be able to bring some developments further forward, and it'll give them a bit more thinking time, so they might be able to spot something or come up with some things that come into play later in the season because they've had an opportunity to think about things more in this period.
Robert Law, not quite sure I understand this one. He says, cut harvesting for the lead car. 500 overtakes per race would make the best racing ever. That's just maths. But if you cut harvesting for the lead car would disappear into the distance, wouldn't it? Or not? Am I missing the point there?
Yeah, not true.
I
guess to allow the cars behind to close up. Is that what he's saying? That because the car in
when you say
it's an advantage.
Okay, all right, yeah, could be that. Yeah, all right, yeah, kind of get it. Okay, next one. This one's in italics, so it's a bit odd. Anyway, it's from Jez James. Says, our Nige, I presume you mean Nigel Mansell there, said that he had a ride in Formula One when he started to see everything so clear and like it was all quite a relatively low speed, which I guess is something one can't make happen. Again, I'm not quite sure what that means, Jez. I'm probably being a bit thick here. Maybe I've been doing the live stream for a bit too long. Quite sure. When Nigel arrived in Formula One, well, we can talk about that. Lots of...
I remember Alan Jones saying that when he got to Formula One, initially the pace of the cars seemed dramatic, and then it seemed to sort of slow down and become more slow motion and just became natural. So maybe he's talking about that. I remember Nico, when he drove the 2018 cars that went to full width with big tyres. He did the first simulator session with the new rules. He got out of that wide-eyed because he said the cars were going to be so quick. But within a couple of races, they're like, getting bored at having to get in the car to do testing and stuff like they always used to do. So they seem to acclimatise to the incredible speeds very quickly, these guys.
This is an interesting point from Kelvin Jacobs. Says, hi, Peter. I'm mid-20s and two of my friends who love Formula One are early 20s. We're quite flustered to hear that our generation asked for these regulations. We miss real racing and wonder who indeed did ask for this. Interesting, isn't it? Because we're talking about the whole we talk about the Netflix generation. Maybe not all of them are. Not all of the 20s are Netflix anyway. Yeah, I mean, who did ask for this? That's the big question, isn't it? I suspect there was a moment when F1 said to the team owners, wouldn't it be great if we had more big manufacturers in the sport, because A, it'd be more money for everybody, and B, if ever you want to sell your team, you can sell it to a big car company. And there's more money there as well, and everything's wonderful. Isn't that the way to go, guys? And they would have said, yeah. And so here we are, and very few people at that point in this meeting of the team owners would have put their hand up and said, no, V10s, put a turbo in the middle, keep it as it was. Nobody would have said that, would they? Because they would have been goggle-eyed at the dollar signs, I guess.
Yeah, I think.
Don't want to put you on a spot there, Mark. But
I think that's true, largely. I mean, they are very money-oriented, a lot of them to some extent. Especially, it's a different generation of team principal now, isn't it? We don't have the team owners so much as the front leading men anymore. But don't you think there was a bit of an existential threat to Formula One and motor racing in general, just because of where we are with the environment? I mean, it did seem. I mean, I'm not saying I agreed with it, but it seemed a little bit anachronistic that we did have big V10 engines even in 2006. 2005.
Oh yeah, I totally. But I've always made the point that Formula One should never have allowed Jean Todt to set up Formula E with its own commercial rights, and Formula One should have set up Formula E, and Formula E should have been part of the Formula One race card, race in, race out around the world, and Formula One should have been seen therefore to be doing all that sustainable energy stuff for Formula E, but not, and then everybody would have understood. But we'll keep Formula One for what it is. It could, and the ultimate show. But because it all went different ways, and because there was a big split between Bernie and Jean Todt, Formula One then went down the compromise route of hybriding its racing engines and being racing and hybrid. And even today, if Formula One owned Formula E and the teams lent a lot of technology to the cars and the Formula One drivers did the odd Formula E race, and we had sustainable fuels in Formula One, I think that would have worked perfectly. That's how I think it should have happened. That's how I think, that's how the governing body of the sport should have enabled it, but they didn't. And so because of that, it is a compromise mess as a result. Not a mess, it's complicated and compromised, which is never good, in my opinion.
No, definitely agree with that.
Lance Lewin, who is one of our channel members, I think. Thank you very much, Lance. Good morning from Georgia, USA. Formula One gear ratios. Are you allowed to share this data? In all other motorsports, this info is shared, but this is one dynamic that is nullified. It's a good point, isn't it? And it comes under the heading of what I often say about how Formula One is so secretive about its technology, that even though it loves to sell its technology as its DNA, the only form of motorsport in the world in which you have to design your own car in order even to enter the championship. And yet we have all this technology, and here we are, you and I and Gavin and others are all trying to sort of understand what's going on. And Formula One doesn't open its doors very well. And gear ratio is a very good point. And you probably more than any other observer, Mark, has pointed out the difference in gearing between the Mercedes factory team this year and the other Mercedes customers. And yet we don't have any real explanations from the teams about that. We don't even have proper data to show what they're doing with the gearing. It'd be really good to have all that, wouldn't it? To understand it. Really... Where is now that you can't change anything, where's the downside in telling the public about it?
Yeah, I would really like to know how that's come about, because to me it's fascinating. It's such a big difference. I mean, 800 RPM roughly, which is the difference we're seeing in 7th, 8th gear. I mean, that's a huge thing. I suspect, because the other thing is that the teams, to make gear ratios is not an easy thing. It's a very long lead time project. So that'll be, although the teams are allowed to change the ratios once during the season, I believe, and then won't be able to for the seasons afterwards. It's not the work of a moment for McLaren to change the ratios in the gearbox, because they just won't have those ratios available, likely. But I'm fascinated to know why Mercedes have gone down that route and McLaren and Alpine have not, with the same engine. There's clearly something going on there. It might be a completely trivial thing, and that's something that actually makes no significant difference to overall lap time, but it can't help feeling that such a big thing is for a reason. It is. I'm very interested to know what's going on there.
And indeed, Lance follows that up with a very nice comment. Peter, thank you for all these down-to-earth, intellectual, thought-provoking conversations. Thank you very much indeed for that very nice comment, Lance. A slightly more controversial comment from Jez James now. You can stay out of this one, Mark, probably. You'll probably laugh when I'm talking about all this. But it says, do you think it's time, Peter, to reflect somewhat when you said last year that Alonso could win the championship in a Newey car? Yeah, well, I have to put my hand up and say I completely underestimated the inability of the Newey Aston Martin marriage to stay on top of things. I never imagined that Adrian would allow things to get away from him in the way they obviously have. And in my mind, I think that's because he completely underestimated I was going to say the difficulties, but I better not say that. I will say the challenges of working with the Strolls. And he probably just made assumptions based on the race teams for whom he's worked, Williams, McLaren, Red Bull, that these things would happen. And yet, obviously, they didn't at Aston Martin. So there he is wearing an Aston Martin cap at the Monaco Grand Prix last year. And he doesn't apparently discover until November that Honda are behind the 8-ball with the development of the engine in the way Adrian wants that engine to be shaped physically and indeed metaphorically. And that is what I underestimated. I still have no doubt that, time factor aside, Fernando Alonso will be super quick in a Adrian Newey car. He's a super quick driver, and Adrian Newey is a great engineer. But I didn't factor in, and I guess it's to my, I don't know what, my shame maybe, that I the inadequacies of the whole Stroll operation. And to have the sort of sanctimonious email from them over the weekend saying that we have this highly skilled management team and Adrian's a part of the package and he's my partner and all the rest of it, with no explanation at all as to why they managed to take their eye off the ball with the whole Honda development for a period of 6 months. It was pretty rich, really, wasn't it? Because somewhere there should have been saying, look at what happened when Honda returned with McLaren. Look at the pitfalls of allowing Honda just to get on with it in Japan on their own. We should have our own setup there. We need to set up a facility right next to Honda, make sure they're totally in sync with the way we're thinking of doing the car, all the architecture of the car, the harmonic vibrations that may or may not occur. All those things should have been set up. And I don't think it's good enough for the owner of the team to say, oh, well, somebody else should have done that. If the owner of the team, go out and do it yourself, because it's pretty obvious that sort of stuff needs to be done. We've got the remit from the Honda McLaren situation, and we know what can happen if things aren't kept tight, and particularly with such a complicated new PU technical regulation. And that didn't happen. And I guess I can only say it's because Adrian it's a function really of how long he's been around and been around goodish teams, that he just assumed that would have happened. And he didn't. And that's where, you could argue in a way, maybe it's not Adrian's job to worry about that, but it is. The overall car includes the power unit, and that's the mistake I made. I just completely underestimated how complicated the Newey-Stroll marriage was going to be. And I still ask the question of myself, which is why he went there in the first place, because we all know how difficult it is working there. And look at the good people that have come and gone. And I still think if Adrian gone to Ferrari had accepted Adrian on his terms and gone to Ferrari, it would have been a very good thing. But he didn't. And he's got his share in the company, he's got his money, and ultimately it will be successful, I'm sure. But too late for Fernando Alonso, I think, sadly. Anything to add there, Mark, or disagree with?
No. I think, having worked with Adrian at McLaren as a very low level compared to what he was doing, he isn't the easiest person to accommodate into a team. As I think a lot of super talented people are, they can be a little tricky to get the most out of. And I think I've said it before. I think the genius of Red Bull was that they gave him the perfect environment to do what he wants to do. In the period, sort of, when was he there from, to 2007 onwards? Although it took a little while, didn't it, even there, for him to show. But that was the perfect environment, and I think certainly McLaren didn't extract the best from Adrian, and that's why he left. And I suspect that Aston Martin or the Strolls have underestimated how much they would need to accommodate him within the team, and he's probably not the best person himself to describe what he wants. I think it needs someone who follows him and understands him as a person and how to integrate him into a team. And whoever that was that did that at Red Bull did a fantastic job of it. Although ultimately they failed and he left them as well. But I think it's just a function of high functioning people, is that they're not always the easiest people to deal with.
Yeah, I would say that person was Christian Horner, and because Christian is a very good man management, and he's very good at reading and working with people like Adrian and understanding how to sell Adrian to various departments of the team in a way that works for everybody. And that's exactly what he did very well. But now the horse has bolted and we've lost all this. We've lost the championship. Well, they've lost this season, or the first half, certainly. It's too late. And now if a Christian went back to, say, Aston Martin, or a Jonathan Wheatley went there, there's nothing they can do because the damage is done. Yeah, of course, Honda will get better and the car will be good, but then you can plug in any number of sort of so-called team principals, or Adrian can go and do the job himself again. But the problem was not, I think the real problem was not learning from the mistakes made by McLaren when they were with Honda, and they just didn't do that. Here's a good question for you, Mark. Yeah, this is from Zavej Dougal. There are reports that Mercedes are breaching the active aero rule. Their front and rear wings are closing and opening in 0.8 of a second when 0.4 is allowed. But why would opening the wings slower be good for them?
Opening the wings slower, I can't see any reason
I can see why closing would be better.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Slowing it down on the closing would help the airflow reattach, potentially. But I can't see any advantage for slowing out the opening. That would just cost you drag. So you wouldn't want to do that, as I understand it. So yeah, and also I just don't see how that's possible that they would be doing that without that being obvious to the FIA anyway, because this data will all be available to them. So, bit of a strange one. I hadn't heard that. That's a new one on me.
And presumably that's a pretty straightforward test you can do in Parc Fermé anyway, is it not? Or does it only work in dynamic form?
I mean, it's a bit like the compression ratio thing, isn't it? Where there's a difference between doing it in a test and potentially doing it on track. And you can't necessarily monitor it completely effectively on track, I guess. But you'd think they'd just be able to look at the data of when the wing's in position X and position Y, and there's a time it takes to get from one to the other, and that's it. It's black and white, isn't it, really?
Autodoc, I think this is under the heading of, did Formula One need to go down this route? It says, there is no environmental debate related to the regulations at all. Even if they ran on regular old petrol and used turbocharged V10s, the cars would still only use a minuscule amount of fuel compared to the total.
Well, and isn't it, I saw a statistic some time ago, I don't know if it's still true, that the most polluting sporting event in the world is the Tour de France, because of if you include all the vehicles, support vehicles, spectator movements, and all that stuff that's associated with it, then that's where the pollution is created, not in the cycling, obviously. And it's the same for Formula One, isn't it? The amount of time the cars are actually on track is minute, and so even if they're doing 1 mile per gallon, the effect of that on global pollution is almost insignificant. But it all comes down to the appearance, doesn't it? That's the important thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And going back to our thing of, Formula One should have remained pure racing V10s, fire burning V10s, tire burning rubber, and we should have adopted a Formula E to run over the same weekend. Of course, you can have your carbon footprint for the factory operations, for the travel around the world, all that other stuff. That's a really good visual thing that Formula One could have done an even better job of selling, I think, to the public. But again, that was all lost on them, I guess. Just going through some of the questions, comments. Yep. Wow, there's so many. We're going to have to end this live stream pretty soon, but I'm going to try and do another one a little bit later this week. I won't in any way ask Mark Slade to spend any more time this week on it, but because I want to save him for the weekend. But I'll probably try and do one. We've got a special guest on Wednesday night teed up, if I can make that happen. And Autodoc continues. Fuels do nothing to eliminate greenhouse gases, still need energy. Energy has to come from somewhere. If you use more solar, then someone else has to burn more carbon, blah, blah, blah. Not blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. Good. This is actually quite a bit cheeky, but I'm going to read it out anyway. It says, I can't even pronounce your name. Sorry. Enos Rasa. It would be nice if you could get somebody to help switch back and forth on the stream, because we miss a lot of what Mark is saying. You didn't miss what he's saying. You miss what he's you're seeing, I think, and not what he's saying. You're hearing what he's saying, I'm sure. We got all the mics turned up. Yeah, that's all right. But no, I agree with you. It would be good if somebody could volunteer, please, to come and do that for me. Thank you. Nice. Right. Did they have to lift and coast in 1988? When they had the 150 litre limit, fuel limit? It was talked about then.
Well, I think lift and coast, I think the first place where that occurred was in IndyCar racing. Certainly that was when I became aware of it, because of this issue of the cars being fuel limited, You cannot put all the fuel you need into an Indy car to complete the race. And I think that's been true forever. So as a technique, I first became aware of it in 2007, and it was something that Lewis had to do to win the Hungarian Grand Prix because there was an error with his car in getting all the fuel in before the race. And lift and coast was something that had been talked about, and we suddenly realised we actually had to implement it for him to actually finish that race. And he did a fantastic job of it, and he did win the race. But the other thing that became apparent in that race was the effect of it on temperatures. And we went to the next race in Valencia knowing that we were going to struggle with tyre temperature, and we made a conscious decision to ask the drivers to do it. So I'm talking 2008, not 2007. It was Hungary in 2008 when we first did it. But the fact is that it's something that's been learned and can't be unlearned. And I'm sure that if we'd applied it to cars prior to 2008, it would still be faster, because the fact is that the fuel burned to make a car go 1 or 2 kilometers an hour quicker at the end of the longest straight is not good use of that fuel, and it would be better to use that fuel somewhere else. It's just a fact. And the tyres are still hotter if you don't do lift and coast than if you do. So it's a learning thing. And if drivers had used it in the past, they would still have gone quicker. Another thing about lift and coast is if you do lift and coast, you don't have to set the front ride height of the car so high, because the car won't back dip as much under braking. So your car will go faster around a track if you can set the front ride height lower, particularly with the ground effect cars. That was a factor, more even so probably than this year's car. So there are all these unseen benefits of doing things that become learned, and once they're learned, you can't unlearn them. But cars and drivers in the past would probably have benefited from doing it. It's just they didn't know.
Yeah, it's I don't know, lift and coast. I'm kind of allergic to lift and coast. I try not to think about it, but I know it's an evil, a necessary evil that we've had for a long time. I'm not sure any of the great drivers that I've known have ever used the phrase lift and coast or ever want to go near it. But there you are. Yeah, I need to apologize for one thing I have been doing, which I've been reading through the things. Sometimes when I forget to do is cut back to Mark when you're talking, Mark. And in that case, I don't have your audio. And that's happened a couple of times. So apologies for that. It's all because I'm slightly stressed, because just before we went on air, for some reason, all the things that were supposed to work didn't. And I had to very rapidly create a whole bunch of new scenes again, which is one of the reasons we don't have all the questions coming up, because that box failed to work completely. So I'm going to have to continue refining what we're doing. We kind of got there in the end, I think, but it's a little bit of a sweat, this one. But don't give up on me. Absolutely, please don't, because we're going to have some great guests coming up very soon. I'm going to have to end it now. I'm just trying to think when one final question. Here we go. This is a good question. That's a nice one. It'll make me feel good. From Haver U815. Peter, would you accept a leadership role at a Formula One team with the promise of being able to execute your ideas without interference if it meant you had to give up or drastically lessen a YouTube channel? Kind of depends on what team it was. I don't think the Strolls would ever ask me to work for them, that's for sure. So it wouldn't be there, I don't think. Depends on the team, depends on the situation. But yeah, I've often, I think all of us, including Mark and all of my friends, would all love to be involved in a team without any complications or politics, and just get on with doing what is right and makes a car work well and a driver work well. And in the famous words of my friend Mo Nunn, who used to created Ensign, great race cars, and didn't have a great time in Formula One, but did a pretty good innings in Formula One, then went to IndyCar. Racing is not complicated. It's not complicated. It's logical. But I think today a lot of what we see is due to overcomplication, too many people, probably too many meetings, too much middle management, too much kowtowing to politics and to money, potential money, and just going racing for the sake of it is something that I would love to do, but it's probably, a pipe dream these days. I don't know, Mark, what would it take for you to go back into Formula One feeling completely excited about it?
I just don't think it's going to happen because of all those things that you mentioned, and it's one of the reasons I'm not doing it now. I remember being asked why I didn't have the ambition to be chief engineer, race engineer at McLaren years ago, and it was because of the personalities involved in the rest of the team that I knew that it would be a situation that I wouldn't enjoy. Because there'd be so many outside pressures on what I wanted to do. And even when I was chief race engineer for 1 year at Renault, and even then I found myself completely hogtied by all the additional pressures. I mean, it was a terrible year anyway. The car wasn't very good. The engine was terrible. And we hadn't done enough development. So it was kind of the worst time to be doing it. But I just found all those outside influences were the things I was juggling. And I wasn't able to actually do any of the things I wanted to be doing that I thought I was actually good at. So you end up doing all the stuff you're bad at badly, and none of the stuff that you think you're good at well, because of all this other stuff. So it seems to be a natural thing for people to progress up, but it isn't really. Engineers don't often make good managers or good leaders because they're not trained in that area. So I think I've always found it a bit odd when that seems to be what is expected to be the natural progression. But I'm also very impressed when people do those jobs very well, because that shows they've got talent in other areas as well. So, and I think that's what we need to recognise. We were talking about this situation with Adrian, and how he performed well at Red Bull. And I think that was a fantastic piece of teamwork to get that performance out of him. And it's always impressive when teams work well.
Here. It's a great feeling when teams work well too, and you're with your mates, and the result is what the hard work deserves. Happens periodically.
2003 was my favourite year in Formula One, working with Kimi, and we didn't even win the World Championship. We almost did. We got close to it, but it was the fact that we weren't expected to, and the whole team was geared around. The whole team I was working with were geared around that objective, which was to try and get Kimi to the World Championship, when there was a large part of the team working on this other car, the MP418, that never actually raced. And that kind of took the pressure off us. And it was a brilliant year. It was the most fun I ever had, because those extra pressures were less obvious and we weren't expected to do well.
Wow. Yeah. I can't remember. What was my favourite year? I guess it was 92, I guess. Yeah. A lot of people think of 92. I think a lot of that comes from the Senna movie as being, well, Nigel had the best car by a mile, and he was always going to win it, and nothing anybody else could do. But you have to see that in the context of the number of years Nigel spent when not only did he not have a race-winning car, he had at best a midfield car. A lot of time in Formula One driving brilliantly to finish 11th with nobody noticing it. And then beyond that, it was a great car, the 14B Williams, but most technically advanced Grand Prix car of all time, because even in 93, they changed the regs a little bit. We'll never see a car of that like again. But did one driver get the maximum from that car? Yes, he did. And he was called Nigel Mansell, and he drove that car on the absolute limit. And it was just a joy to watch from day to day, corner to corner, lap to lap. It was just superb. Do you remember 92, Mark?
I absolutely do. I remember being at Silverstone in the crowd to watch that race. I was already working for McLaren by then, but we were able to get tickets to go to the race, and couldn't help but be impressed by how good that car was and how well that team was working. And I joined McLaren at the end of 91, and obviously McLaren had just won 5 championships, and I have to say there was an element of complacency within that team. And the 91 Williams was obviously a superb car, but held back by mainly reliability issues, I think. And then the 92 car was a huge step forwards, even though it was essentially the same car, but it just went to another level, didn't it? And having seen the McLaren of 91, and I thought, I was actually a bit disappointed in that car, because it was obviously the ultimate evolution of the original McLaren MP41, but in many ways it hadn't advanced. Technologically, it was quite low tech, and it was just you had Ayrton Senna, you had a fantastic engine and a well-financed, well-run team. But the car itself was not necessarily the best car. And you could kind of see it. And I remember going into 92 and some people in the drawing off saying, oh, just wait till, we get going with the 92 car, which was going to have automatic transmission and eventually active suspension. And I just thought, I don't think it's going to be like that. I think if Williams get their act together, they're going to blow us away. And they did. So, yeah, you could see it coming. But it was enjoyable, even as the opposing team. It was actually enjoyable to see a team working so well. There isn't anything better than getting in a group of people and all moving in the right direction. It's a fabulous feeling.
Yeah, well, it was. And I'll always remember those years, 91, 92, and I was lucky enough to be there. Finishing on a great question for you, Mark, actually, from Miran DD9. Hi, Mark. Your best weekend with Haas, practice, qualifying, race, everything worked almost to perfection. When was that?
It was Mexico in the last year, 24, when I think Kevin finished 7th. But we just had a good weekend, and in the race he was just driving brilliantly, and we'd got the car right into the window. And a 7th place finish was something that most people wouldn't have noticed, but for us, it was just, the feeling was just so good to actually come out of the weekend knowing that we'd actually got the maximum performance out of the car. And it's so important for team members, because you're never going to win every race. It's impossible, even for the best car and best team. Even if you have a year when you win most of the races, that's going to be a special year. So what you have to measure yourself by is, did we get the most out of what we have? And when you do, it's a great feeling. When you've actually contributed yourself and everyone else has worked well as well to something that was the best you can do, then you come out a weekend and you can have a beer at the airport and think, yeah, we did all right that weekend, even if nobody else noticed. It's a good feeling.
It is a great feeling, Mark. Thank you so much for your time and for being with us. Absolutely brilliant. Would you come back again?
Always. I am passionate at heart about it, and that can be a problem for me. And I love talking about this stuff, and it's also always good to have alternative points of view as well. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I enjoyed the show a lot. And I enjoyed all your questions and comments too. As difficult as some of them were, thank you very much indeed for taking part, everyone. And thanks for those who've joined as channel members as well. And if you haven't, it's something you can look forward to. I think hopefully there'll be lots of additional content. And I'm going to try and do another live stream for the end of this week as well. So watch our community space. I'm starting to think about the community space on our channel as the place really to express some thoughts and really get into some stuff. So I've written quite a long piece. I read a long piece about yesterday about what happened over the weekend and various other things, bits and bobs. So see it as a sort of new magazine, online magazine, our community section. So there you go. Yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. And Japanese Grand Prix. Wow. This Friday, Saturday and Sunday we'll be doing the usual videos, and yeah, we'll see what happens at the great Suzuka Circuit with the new regulations and cars. So big thanks to Mark Slade again. Big thanks to Track Ninja, OEM Exclusive, Jetcraft and REC Watches for their support of this channel. And of course for you, the viewers and listeners, for your support as well. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.